Hi, I'm Sean Langell, and I'm excited to talk to you about a subject near and dear to my heart. I've worked in radio for well over 10 years, digital audio, and I think it's really starting to shape our world today. More and more people have iPods, are carrying digital audio with them, and it's presented a lot of threats and challenges to the way television and radio reach you. And that's a real challenge when you have competitors like Pandora, Spotify, and other digital audio technologies that, one, give you, the consumer, more choices, but also make it more challenging for radio stations to reach that audience. So, jumping into things, taking a look at what we want to cover: analog versus digital audio, technological developments, regulation, current trends, and factors to watch. I know I have a lot of slides here, a lot of information. I'm going to try and break it down, make it more simple for you, and hit some of the key points. I like the quote at the beginning of the chapter because it talks about the celestial jukebox. Quality and reliability, though. That quote came from 2009. And I think we're almost there, where we have this dream of a celestial jukebox right in front of us, where we can get almost any song at any time. Taking a look at some of the background, analog versus digital audio, that's spelled out for you on slide 4, and some of the history of audio technologies on slide 5, and kind of what World War II did for that. It's interesting how the wars and even the sinking of Titanic brought a lot of some of the regulation and some of the innovation. And that's some interesting ways to study, even how the FCC, the Federal Communications, came about through the sinking of Titanic. And that's another side thing that you can take a look at that you might find a little bit more fascinating in the development of those technologies. Slide 8 takes a look at some of those histories of the technologies, from cards to 8 tracks to CDs, where things got really revolutionized in the 1980s. I know I'm moving very fast here, but that's just a brief survey of some of that history. Slide 7 gets into some of the specifics of sampling and quantizing. Just to give you the main points about that: digital audio, it is not an exact copy, and here's what I mean. Even my voice that's being recorded right now, it is taking short samples of that. What that means, say for CD quality rate, it is actually 44.1 kilohertz. What that means is that in a given minute, there are 4,401 samples of my voice that go through. As you can see, Blu-ray DVD audio, the more samples those are, when you get into super audio megahertz, it's almost a very crystal clear audio. If you've ever listened to some of your MP3 recordings that may be at a lower bit rate, you can hear some of that lossiness in that. And those are some of those sampling rates that you can take a look on slide 7. Slide 8 takes a look at some of the file formats and codecs. It allows audio creators to compress the audio, zipping it. The first kind of digital audio that we saw, if you remember back in the days of Windows 95 and even Windows 3.11, was Wave, was the Microsoft version, and the AIFF was the Mac version. They were lossless formats, which means pretty close to analog, no compression there. Pretty sound, pretty good quality. The problem is you couldn't send those through emails. Then you get into MP3s, where you can really squash those things down but not really lose much of the quality. So that's when you get into some of the issues of copyright. Now that people can transmit pretty decent quality recordings of music, of just about anything, how do artists protect themselves? So as we get into slide 9, that's kind of what performers want to do: safeguard their earnings. So then in 1992, we're on slide 10, comes the Audio Home Recording Act of 1992. You can read more about that, but the basic goal was to limit multi-generational recordings. And by that is, I record again, and so there's so many copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. Interesting thing is that did not apply to CD-ROM devices, but does not necessarily provide immunity for consumers using those technologies. On slide 11, you get to the next piece of regulation, the Digital Performance Rights and Sound Recording Act. That applied to digital cable, satellite, music services. And exempt from that was radio and TV. Just a side note to that, radio stations actually do pay licensing fees on a yearly basis to ASCAP and BMI, the Association of Songwriters, Composers, Artists, and Performers. They pay yearly fees to play their music on the radio. That's how musicians get royalties from what's played on the radio. Then in 1997 is the Electronic Theft Law that provided civil and criminal penalties for MP3 trading. So as you see, as technology has developed, regulation is kind of playing catch up with that. The Electronic Theft Law, that's on slide 12. On slide 13, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It was cracking down on copyright protection codes, but here's the interesting thing that it did permit. It permitted cracking of codes for encryption, for research, exemptions and anti-circumvention provisions for nonprofits, libraries, educational institutions, and paying appropriate royalties. That continues a little bit on slide 13, the DMCA of 1998, those key agreements and kind of how the sound exchange works. You can read more about that. Some of the results of the DMCA on slide 14, traditional compulsory license from ASCAP, BMI, CSAC. Those are the licensing organizations. Voluntary direct licensing for other internet, jukebox, and compilation CDs. And then as things came along with technology, the question was not only using digital audio to put the music out there, but how to use technology to protect the rights of artists. Slide 17 talks about that. Digital rights management, DRM, it's that umbrella term for technologies that enforce copyright protection, the layering, analysis, valuation. Opponents argue that it's the loss of existing user rights, and it stifles innovation. You can see this on Apple FairPlay, non-music iTunes content, Windows DRM, and especially if you've noticed this, if you've used Mac computers and iTunes, if something is in someone else's iTunes library, they purchased it off of there, they can't necessarily share it with you. That's an example of digital rights management. A specific case of this, MGM versus Grokster, you can read about that on slides 17 and 18, basically says technology providers are liable for infringement if technologies are promoted as infringement tools, which is why a few years ago when you saw LimeWire, if that was something you used maybe to share music legally, they never marketed it as such. But if it's marketed as such for copyright infringement, that is illegal. But the interesting with this suit, the interesting thing here is technologists could develop without fear of legal action for possible infringement. That all continues on slide 17, 18, and 19. And on slide 19, you see a little bit more of the copyright in the courts, the Department of Justice, and the RIAA lawsuits. We're actually looking at several different aspects of it. Group piracy, intellectual property, phishing for personal info. And in February of 2010, the DOJ actually set up a task force to deal with intellectual property rights. And so it's still such a new legal area too. So many lawsuits, so many ways for rights of artists to be protected, balanced with the rights of innovation, and it's still going on. On slide 25, we see the digital audio tape. Uses tape as a medium. The DAT tax created through Audio Home Recording Act of 92. So you see that there's taxes and regulation that go along with digital audio. The compact disc, a little bit more about that. Revolutionized audio technology is highly favored among consumers, and by 1989, Sony and Philips developed rewritable CDs. This was more so in use of radio stations, professional places, and then by the mid to late 90s actually made its way into people's homes. MP3, well, there's the limitations of WAV. MPEG, it's the Moving Picture Experts Group. MPEG Audio Layer 3 is actually what MP3 stands for. It's entropy encoding, reduces the number of redundant sounds in audio signal, and actually you can take audio from a CD and shrink it by a factor of 12. And it can be played on portable players like Apple's iPod, the Microsoft Zune, and Creative, which isn't as much of a player in there, but they had early MP3 players.